So we're focused at the moment on virtue in the sense that we are in pursuit of a certain ideal of what it means to be a human being, and it sort of grows out of our rationality in the sense that we're not just beings who exist and live. We are beings who exist, live, and think about our own being and think about how we want to live or how we should live. And virtue is a way of characterizing success, one might say, in the way we live. But let's get Platonic about it or Socratic about it. What is virtue? I mean, that was how Socrates approached the question, by asking what virtue was. And Aristotle, who's a different sort of thinker, also, in a way, asks what virtue is, but not in that wide open way that Socrates wanted to discuss the matter. I think the first thing that Aristotle would say about, what is virtue, well, which kind are you talking about? Look at the first sentence in this reading. Virtue, then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral. Well, so what are we talking about? The moral virtues or the intellectual virtues? Well, that's a difficult question to get into, the difference between them. But I've always been a little bit perplexed at the idea of an intellectual virtue. But the most prominent one would be wisdom, being wise. But also I would imagine quickness of intelligence or insight. But it's the moral virtues that take up a lot more, I think, discussion. And the difference between an intellectual virtue and a moral virtue, what that necessitates is, to some degree, a discussion of Aristotle's theory of human nature. So in a certain way, we have to go back to the first reading. If we look back at what he says in Book 1, he's got a certain theory of human nature. That is, what does the human being consist of? And it's got three levels. The purely biological level, which would be the physical. Human beings are living creatures, and they share that nature with all other living things, plant and animal. And then there's the level at the other side, the intellectual, rational level. And let's say that, when we think about our heart beating and our nervous system, nerves firing, electrical impulses, when we think about just the very basics of, sensation, the senses, we're talking about the biological. And at the other side, well, what we're doing now, me trying to explain Aristotle's ethics on a broad level, you trying to follow what I'm saying, that's an intellectual or rational enterprise. But crucially, Aristotle thinks that between these two poles, there's a middle level. And I don't know how we would really characterize it. This is a very important point that he makes, that this middle level of human nature, which is not purely biological and not purely intellectual, is sort of rational, but not in the full sense. It's rational in the sense that it's capable of listening to reason or being influenced by reason. And I would say that this middle level is really feeling. If you tell your purely biological level, let's say your digestion, to speed up or slow down, or you can't do that, right? You can't influence the purely biological processes of your body by intellectual means, by telling them to do something. But this middle level can be influenced by the rational level, on this level of feeling. So that's kind of, this is the place where moral virtue comes into play. Moral virtue turns out to be how we deal with our feelings, and the important word here is habit. Go back to the text. He says, virtue then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching. That is, we learn intellectually through teaching the intellectual virtues, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit, practice, habit. So that becomes incredibly important in Aristotle's ethics, this notion of habit. How exactly do I obtain the moral virtues? Things like, I might as well start naming them. Let's take a virtue like courage, for instance, or I don't know, something like less important virtue like generosity, or one of the essential virtues, cardinal virtues, moderation, sometimes called temperance. How do I become a courageous person? How do I become a temperate or moderate person? Basically through practice. And the practice is really a practice in because when we think about, let's say, a virtue of courage, what is the virtue of courage really about? It's about how we deal with a particular feeling. And that feeling is fear. The courageous person how do I become a courageous person? And who is the courageous person? Well, Aristotle would say that the most obvious answer is wrong. And the most obvious answer is that because that's actually wrong. Courageous people feel just as much fear as everyone else. So that's wrong. Courageous people feel the right amount of fear in the right way, at the right time. If you're a soldier in an army and the other army is running at you, think of the way that the ancient Greeks fought with spears and swords and shields. It's not only normal to feel fear, it's good to feel fear. You should be afraid. You can get killed in a really horrible way. So if you feel no fear at all when the army is running towards you, you might really do something stupid. Right? So you don't want to feel no fear. But if you feel too much fear, you're going to run away. And you know what? I've never been in battle. I've never been in an army. I don't know what I would do, but I guess you're not supposed to run away. You're supposed to stand your ground when it's reasonable. So you want to feel the right amount of fear, not too little so that you do something stupid, but not so much that you run away, because Aristotle would say that's the corresponding vice. It's cowardice, somebody who can't control their fear, somebody who's too fearful. But somebody who is not fearful enough, we might call them rash, doing something silly, right? And so between feeling too much fear and feeling too little fear, there's what Aristotle calls the mean. that balance point. And that's how he thinks of all the moral virtues, as feeling the right amount of a feeling in the right way. That's reaching the mean, the kind of balance point between the two extremes. So vice, which is the opposite of virtue, means is being at one or the other of the extremes. Let's take something like generosity. Generosity is a feeling of pity and sympathy for somebody who is suffering, so that you naturally want to help them. If you feel too little of that, if you don't feel any of that feeling of pity and sympathy, then you would be at one extreme, and you would be a miser. You would be miserly. Now, the opposite extreme, there's no real word for it, and Aristotle acknowledges that sometimes there's no word for some of these extremes. But if you felt too much pity or sympathy with people who are suffering, you may give away all of your money and end up in a bad spot yourself, or you may give too much, more than the situation actually calls for. Let's take something we've all done, like tipping. I mean, what is the right tip? Well, if you go to a diner and you have your meal and you leave 20%, you are okay, right? If you leave like 50%, well, I mean, is that too much? Well, I mean, it depends. Maybe it's a special occasion. Maybe it's a holiday. Maybe there are special circumstances. But probably it's too much. Whereas if you leave nothing, or if somebody gives you service and you leave like 5%, guess what? That's too little, So when it comes to something like giving, generosity, most of us stick in the 15-20% range. I think I've been told that 20% is standard now. When I was growing up, it was 15%. But I'm telling you, 20% is that is standard tip. Anything below that, is considered below standard. But tipping is a very, very complex thing. Actually, most people just leave 20% these days, and usually that's fine. They don't think about it very much. But when it comes to giving, it's an interesting example because you can give too much. You can have a kind of a tasteless tip, or give somebody a gift that's too much. And we've all sort of been in those experiences where somebody gives too much and it's kind of embarrassing. You want to give just the right amount. That's kind of a trivial example, but it's what I think it's in line with the kind of thing that Aristotle is talking about when he describes virtue as a mean. It's a notion that's borrowed from, obviously, from mathematics. It's from arithmetic. It's about numbers, essentially, I think. And it's not exactly the middle point, because he doesn't want to make that. It's not really about getting right in the middle. It's about getting at some almost indefinable balance point, which is sort of the right thing for the situation. So that is why Aristotle characterizes, or I think what he means when he characterizes virtue, at least moral virtue, as a mean between two extremes, the balance point. Yeah, I mean, he says it in several places, but for instance, right here, he says at top of page 7, virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice lying in a mean. That is, the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle. And by what principle? By which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now, it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. Excess is too much, defect is too little. And again, it is mean because the vices respectively fall short or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate, that which is in between the extremes. Hence, in respect of its substance and the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean with regard to what is best and right and extreme. Well, that's just a play on the idea, meaning that it's outstanding to be virtuous, although virtue is kind of finding that middle balance point. So that, I think, explains, or I hope explains, a fairly crucial concept in this reading, and that is the idea that virtue is a mean, and that virtue is really something that we achieve through habit, because habit is something that deals with feelings and actions rather than conscious choices. Many things that we do in life, many things, I would say most things that we do in life, we don't think them through. We do them reflexively. We do them naturally. And so we do them in accord with the kind of habits that we have acquired. And the point is to acquire the right habits.